What you're going to see in the notes today as we start Unit 3 is mainly vocabulary. So as we're going through the video, I'm not going to spend too much time waiting for you to take notes. So please feel free to pause the video, take notes on the vocab terms, and then resume the video to continue. That way you can kind of work through at your own pace. So we are looking at a few terms in statistics that are pretty important. The first one is data, which is just the information that we're collecting when we do our statistical studies. So information that comes from observations or measurements or some sort of response from our sample. And then statistics overall is really just the process of organizing all of that data. So collecting it, making it meaningful in some way. So looking at numerical calculations or looking at graphical representations of that data, and then determining what sort of conclusions or decisions we can make based on the data that was collected. We do have to make the distinction between two different groups here. We have a population and a sample. So the population is the entire group. So if we wanted to look at SAT scores of high school students, then the population would be all high school students. Usually, we can't get information from everybody in the population, so we use a subset of that population, which is called a sample, and we collect data from that group. So if we're still interested in SAT scores of high school students, maybe we don't measure every high school student. Maybe we take a selection of several hundred high school students. Those several hundred high school students would make up our sample. If our sample is collected in a statistically sound way, which we'll talk about later in the term, if we have a good representative sample, then we can make claims about our population from that sample group. So here's an example. I'll give you a second to read it. So in this example, we're going to identify the population and the sample. So take a minute to think about that. So here the population would be all gas stations. We don't know how many there are. We just know that it's all gas stations, probably in the US. And then our sample would be the 800 gas stations that they surveyed. So a subset of all gas stations. And so here, what does the data set consist of? I wrote over it just a little bit, but the data set is going to consist of their prices for the gallon of gas. And then that information was organized in such a way that they could calculate the average price on February 12th. So when we talk about populations and samples, we also have a term that describes the numbers that we get from those groups. So parameter is going to be a number that describes the population, and then a statistic is going to be a number that describes the sample. So the two P words go together, the two S words go together. So the population, this is the group, the sample is the group. The parameter and statistic are numbers. So a lot of times students can remember that the two P words go together and the two S words go together, but then they forget which one is the number and which one is the group. So here's another example. So in this case, we're looking at the numerical value. We want to determine whether that $82,000 is a parameter or a statistic. Here they tell us it was a sample of MBAs that had an average salary of $82,000. So that means that this is going to be a statistic because it's describing the sample. This second one here The number is the 8.5%. And it's starting salaries for the 667 MBA graduates. So this is the whole group or the population. So the 8.5% is describing the population, which means that it's a parameter. We have a few different methods of data collection that we talk about in this course. One of them is an observational study, and the name pretty much describes what's happening here. You're just observing what's happening in the natural setting. So there's no attempt to influence the responses in an observational study. So an example of an observational study would just be observing jaywalkers at an urban intersection. Maybe you want to count the proportion of individuals that don't cross in the crosswalk. You would just put yourself in a position to make those counts, but not try and influence the individuals in any way. We also have an experiment, and this is what we really need to try and do, is make a well-designed experiment so that we can draw conclusions from our data. And in an experiment, you're giving a treatment to part of the population or part of your sample. If you're performing an experiment and if it's well designed, you would have a control group or a baseline treatment. So some cases would use a placebo. And if you're not familiar with the term placebo, this is really just like a sugar pill or what they call a dummy treatment. So an individual is receiving something, but it's just not the active ingredient that's being studied. So an example here is, does a new medication reduce, and it's cut off here, but I think does a new medication will say reduce cholesterol. So you might give one group a new medication, give another group a placebo, or you could give them an existing treatment to see whether or not the new treatment works better than the existing treatment, but something to compare the new medication to. So your assignment for today is to work on page 8, questions 2 to 36 evens. A lot of this is going to be reading a scenario and identifying the population and the parameter, the sample and the statistic. One thing that I do want to mention, if I go back to this example here where we had the statistic, the $82,000 from the sample of MBAs. If you were asked to describe population parameter, sample, and statistic here, the sample would be the group of MBAs, the 82,000 would be the statistic. For the population, we would just say, basically, what's the whole group that these individuals were drawn from? So it would be all MBAs. And the parameter isn't given, so we don't have a numerical value for it. It's unknown, and it would be the average salary of all MBAs. So when you see things like that in the textbook problems, just know that sometimes there are going to be values that you don't know. And so in that case, you're just going to describe what it would be, but you don't have a numerical value to go with it. So again, that assignment is page 8, 2 to 36 evens. And if you have questions about anything, just make a note of what questions you have and we can talk about them in class next time we meet.